Boldwood presents Relative Love, written by Amanda Brookfield and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. W.B. Yeats, The Second Coming. 2003, December. John Harrison, returning from the lower field with a barrowful of holly, the leaves a polished leathery green, the berries blood-red baubles in the dusky light, paused at the familiar sight of his home. A sudden drop in temperature, coming after the freakish unseasonal warmth of the day, had created a thin band of waist-high mist, as thick as wool from a distance, but dissolving to invisibility as he waded through it. The slate tiles and grey stone chimney stacks of Ashley House rose out of this trick of nature like some magical and majestic ship on a ghostly sea, its numerous lead-latticed windows extravagantly illuminated, thanks to the arrival that afternoon of 4 children, several spouses, and 7 grandchildren, shining like portholes against the darkening sky. John, inclined normally to keep a beady eye on thermostat dials and light switches when Pamela and he were alone, felt a glow of pride at so much evidence of occupation. Apart from the absence of horses and hay in the outhouses and barns, and the thick twists of ivy and wisteria trunks across the walls, there had been few physical changes to the property since a windfall on the corn market had allowed John's Victorian grandfather, Edmund Harrison, to commission the building of the family home. It had been called Ashley House after his wife, Violet Ashley, who had died in childbirth. The only significant architectural additions since that time had been undertaken by their son, Albert, John's father, who had installed a long arched porch running the full length of the back house, connected to each of the affected rooms by a series of French windows. Known in family parlance as the cloisters and built in the same soft grey brick as the walls to which it was attached, it was a construction that stole a lot of natural light from the interior, but which was generally forgiven this defect for looking so fine, particularly from the outside, and for providing excellent sitting-out space in the summer. John's own architectural dabblings had been restricted to a conversion of the largest barn into what was, somewhat disparagingly, referred to as the granny flat, but which was, in fact, a spacious 2-bedroomed little house, complete with its own kitchen and bathroom and front door, ideal for overflow at busy times of year. On this occasion, Alicia, his widowed and increasingly irascible sister, was housed there, so she could be completely comfortable, Pam had soothed, easing over the crinkle of suspicion in her sister-in-law's eyes that her company was not as eagerly sought after as she would have liked. John released his grip on the barrow handles and flexed his fingers, which was stiff with cold, and sore too from foolishly tackling the holly without the protection of gloves, and continued to stare at the house, squinting as, from time to time, figures moved across the windows, busy in various easily imagined ways, unpacking suitcases, wrapping gifts, preparing infants for bed or food for the evening meal. There would be salmon, as usual on Christmas Eve, steamed with Pamela's customary light touch to a succulent white pink, so that the flesh fell off the bones and melted on the tongue, and a generous selection of vegetables that always included beetroot, a particular favourite of John's, freshly pulled from Ashley House's own well-stocked vegetable garden. The sprouts served at lunch the following day would also be homegrown, their leaves pale green and tasting faintly of earth and mint. For the younger members of the clan, with palates not yet sufficiently discerning to enjoy such flavours, there would be simpler alternatives: toad in the hole instead of fish, peas instead of beetroot. The sprouts, however, were unavoidable. At least one on each plate at Christmas lunch was one of those small traditions that had somehow become unquestionable over the years, as such things did in established families, where the minutest ways of speaking and doing took on the comforting resonance of ritual. "Here we are again, old fella," John murmured, prodding the mud-clogged tip of one Wellington boot against the grizzled belly of the black Labrador slumped on the ground next to him. "Christmas at Ashley House. Won't be too many more of those for you, eh?" The dog, who was 12 years old and painfully arthritic unless in pursuit of rabbits, half raised its head, offered a desultory wag of acknowledgement, then dropped its jaw with an audible thwack back onto its outstretched paws. John bent to pick up the barrow handles and began to weave a somewhat unsteady route up towards the garden, aware of the heaviness of his boots and the mounting knot of stiffness in his lower back. He chose the nearest of the various gates posted round the garden and paused to check on a lopsided hinge, making a mental note to return that way soon with a hammer and nails. Boots lumbered after him, ignoring the open gate and burrowing under a loose section in the mesh wiring which John had painstakingly rigged round the garden's substantial boundaries in a bid to deter the rabbit population from socialising on the lawn. A few seconds later, the dog trotted back to his side, looking at once triumphant and sheepish, his nose smeared with fresh mud and an assortment of dead leaves and twigs scattered across his back. "Daft beast," growled John fondly, adding the loose meshing to his list of things to see to, a list that never seemed to shorten or end and which, while he liked to groan about it, was, he knew, connected to some vital sense of purpose and well-being. The tending of the garden itself never touched his conscience. He had learned over the years to leave all such nurturing and forethought to his wife, Pamela, who was as dexterous and skilled with seedlings as she was with the jars of ingredients ranged around the oak shelves in the kitchen. She had a library of books on English country gardens and a visionary talent for applying their lore to the fenced 2 acres surrounding the house. A local man called Sid helped her, emitting monosyllabic grunts of acquiescence to her every command, whether it involved weeding, mowing, or lopping branches off trees. No physical challenge ever seemed too great for his wiry frame, although he puffed at pungent roll-ups all day and had the weathered face of a man well past his 70th birthday. Occasionally, John teased Pamela about the physical prowess of their employee, professing jealousy, not because he felt any. After 50 years together, sex and all its exhausting complications, lust, envy, frustration, longing, had slid so far down the agenda they were practically out of sight. But because he liked to see how the echo of a reference to such fierce emotions made her smile. In truth, John was happy to be left to dabble in the fields and woods comprising the remaining 20 acres of the estate, attending to clogged ditches, sagging fences and rebellious outcrops of brambles and nettles. Armed often with just a walking stick, he had several to choose from lined up along the wall of the garden shed, their knobbled handles smooth from use, his beloved multi-purpose penknife and a few bits of wire and string. He would spend up to several hours at a time lost in the Ashley House grounds, humming contentedly at his small, invariably doomed attempts to keep nature at bay. Sometimes, on chilly or particularly dank mornings, Pamela would slip into his anorak pocket a little thermos of tea, which he would drink sitting on a tree stump, sucking on his pipe, marvelling at familiar things, like the cosy, undulating beauty of the Sussex countryside, or that he had somehow arrived at the outrageously advanced age of 79 without serious mishap to himself or any member of his family. All 4 of his children were in good health, as were their various offspring. His sister Alicia had lost her husband some years before, but was otherwise well, as was her son, Paul, who had married an Australian girl and settled in Sydney. The only real shadow to fall across the picture had been cast by Eric, his elder brother, who, thanks to a severe stroke in his 50s, had for many years been resident in a nursing home. But then, as Pamela was so good at pointing out, Eric had had a marvellous innings, playing soldiers in foreign countries and pursuing all manner of harebrained adventures before fate had played its cruel hand. The home he was in now was just a few miles away, allowing them to make regular visits and keep an eye on the quality of nursing care, which had not always been top-notch. These days, since Eric's own savings had dried up, John paid the nursing home fees, which were substantial. There was nothing more they could do, Pamela had assured him that morning, when the combination of a bill from the nursing home and the prospect of yet another Christmas without the once stimulating presence of his beloved big brother had made John sigh. They would visit him on Boxing Day as usual, with a string of grandchildren in tow, she said, offering instant and tremendous solace, as she always did.
"If it wasn't for him,"
John began, sliding a piece of toast into the right side of his mouth because of some twanging among the roots of his teeth on the other side. "We wouldn't be here," Pam had finished for him, using the brisk tone she reserved for this inevitable next step in any Eric conversation, which referred to her brother-in-law's decision 5 decades earlier to hand over the family home to John and take off round the world instead. Although Eric had never made any show of regretting his decision, on the contrary, he'd always seemed to revel in his rootless bachelor life. A residue of uneasiness about it had pursued John through the years. He had given Eric the lion's share of the money instead. But money wasn't the same as property. Eric's savings were exhausted, but Ashley House was now worth $2 million at least. More importantly, the house was like an integral part of the family, a character in its own right, whose mossy, weathered walls had protected 3 generations of Harrisons with the quiet defiance of what felt to John, particularly in a sentimental mood as he was now, with the house bulging and the scent of Christmas in the air, like some kind of timeless, protective love. Over the years, the house had not just contained the family, but grown round them all, as intertwined and inseparable from their lives as the Victorian roses twisting through the old arched pergola skirting the lawns and the honeysuckle knotted along the stone wall of the kitchen garden. John pushed the barrow slowly, trying not to hunch his shoulders in accordance with the Chichester chiropractor's advice and stamping his feet in the hope of shedding some of the mud from the soles of his boots. Inside the tunnel of the pergola, his favourite route back to the house, it was dark and silent, save for the gentle scrape of the dog's claws on the paving stones and the occasional squeak of the barrow wheel. Around him, a few brave rosebuds, pearly white bulbs, glimmered from among the tangle of leaves. Through the criss-crossed thicket overhead, stars were twinkling between patches of dispersing cloud. John, a little chilled now, hurried on. There was still so much to do. For one thing, he would need a bath, if there was any hot water left, which he doubted, with hordes of women washing their hair and the children having the mud scrubbed off their knees. Pam would require help putting up the holly. Wine had to be cooled for dinner. Peter had kindly brought several bottles of savoured, which were still sitting on the sideboard. After which, a contingent of the family would bundle into a couple of cars to attend midnight mass at St. Margaret's, the little Norman church on the far side of Barham village. And he still had to wrap his gifts, a modest clutch as usual. Pam orchestrated all the serious present-giving within the family, but which would take some time since he was all fingers and thumbs when it came to sellotape and folding paper corners. It seemed incredible that he had once fitted in so many duties with a full-time job. Not long ago, Christmas Eve would have been spent in the office, before a scramble for last-minute shopping in Victoria Street and a sprint for the 6:15. The 13 years since John's retirement had slipped through his fingers with terrifying speed, although, as a Lloyd's member, he continued to take a serious interest in the business, regularly meeting with ex-colleagues in London to discuss old times and the vagaries of the insurance market, still reeling from the Towers atrocity 2 years before. Talking shop was always a joy, but afterwards John would slump gratefully into his train seat for the journey home, relishing without shame the simple prospect of a pot of tea and the steady hand of his wife to pour it for him. John was a few yards from the house when the necklaces of light, arranged by him with much cursing, among its tangle of rampaging ivy, sprang to life, triggered by a timer switch, which, no matter how cunningly he tried to outwit it, continued each year to pursue a schedule of its own. Every year John treated Pamela's suggestion that a new device might be a worthy investment with a gruff dismissal. Like the single sprout on the plate of each protesting grandchild, grappling with wilful Christmas lights had somehow become integral to his view of the festive scenery. A challenge when they resisted, a cause for immense satisfaction when they didn't. Besides, he didn't like throwing things away, even things that didn't work. It felt too much like giving up, and he'd never been one for that. Cassie, at 37, the youngest of John and Pamela Harrison's children, pulled her bedroom curtains shut, kicked off her shoes, which looked fabulous but hurt like hell, and settled herself among the half-unpacked clutter on her bed. She would put them back on to go downstairs, slip them off under the table during dinner, then put them on again for church. A family Christmas had always demanded a certain sartorial elegance, which she enjoyed. Being grand did make things feel special. And in a week or two the shoes would be fine. It was her feet that were the problem, small and wide, so that practically everything rubbed in the wrong places to start with, even if they got to be as comfy as slippers later on. She'd been staring out of the window for some time, thinking that the veil of rolling mist was just as atmospheric as snow, and wondering whether to make her own small contribution to it by lighting a cigarette. She was supposed to be on 5 a day and had already had 6. When she spotted her father wheeling his barrow of holly up from the copse at the bottom of the field, Boots waddling at his heels. She raised her knuckles to rap on the window, but stopped at the last minute, overwhelmed by troubled fondness at how decrepit he looked, as lumbering and stiff-limbed as his dear old hound. He wouldn't see her anyway, Cassie told herself, tugging the curtain shut, feeling suddenly that she was spying. These days his eyesight was poor, a problem compounded by his reluctance to acknowledge it and the family's tacit willingness, led by Pamela, to collude in the process. The hair-raising experience of a car journey in his company was never due to his glasses prescription being out of date, but to the bloody-mindedness of other drivers. They were all protecting him, but from what? He would die anyway, whether he wrapped his car round a tree, lost his footing on the reedy edge of Ashley Lake, or had a heart attack. Cassie sat down on her bed with a sigh, trying to picture a world without her parents, who annoyed her terribly at times, but to whom she was unequivocally devoted. It was impossible to imagine pain of any kind, she decided. Impossible, really, to feel anything in advance of the feeling itself, especially not on Christmas Eve, when everything was poised and perfect, and when all she really wanted to think about was Daniel Lambert, a London GP for whom she felt an altogether different and entirely consuming love, whose very presence on the planet, even miles away in Derbyshire, surrounded by his wife, children, and by all accounts quite hideous in-laws, made Cassie feel both immortal and blessed. Placing her mobile phone tenderly on the pillow next to her, even though Dan had warned her that he probably wouldn't call, she folded her arms and looked round the familiar contours of the room, which had been hers ever since she could remember, and which always made her feel a curious combination of comfort and frustration. She was an established freelance interior designer, Cassie reminded herself, with a string of clients and her own website. Yet, sitting now on the old threadbare beige counterpane, she felt as if she'd never moved on from being a little girl and never would. Her surroundings were like a kaleidoscopic snapshot of the first 2 decades of her life. The pinboard of faded rosettes, the framed music and ballet certificates, the collection of soft toys propped against each other like a band of war-weary veterans on top of the bookcase, the beads she no longer wore draped round the mirror on the dressing table, the trinket boxes containing obsolete coins and single earrings whose partners had gone missing, but which she still hoped vaguely to find one day. Peachy silk curtains had replaced the Barbie pink on which she had insisted as a schoolgirl, and several layers of creamy paint had long since freshened the once fuchsia walls. The carpet was still the same, however, covered in rugs these days to conceal its age, but fraying visibly at the edges, especially where it met the little cast-iron fireplace set into the wall opposite the bed. Overhead, the heavy roof timbers, which ran the length of the top floor of the house, seemed to sag slightly, as did the stretches of ceiling between, as if the entire structure was preparing to cave inwards. As a child, Cassie had devoted many dark hours to worrying about this, especially when she could hear the scrabble of rodent feet behind the plaster, which conjured terrifying images of debris and animals with sharp teeth tumbling out of the night on top of her. A series of Ashley House cats had eventually sorted out the problem, the latest of which, a ginger Tom called Samson, was lying now in the furthest corner of the window seat, curled up tight with his head half buried under his paws, stoutly ignoring both Cassie and the muffled thumps coming from downstairs. Cassie's was the only bedroom in the house without a basin, a cause at some hazy adolescent stage of her life for serious complaint. But it had a wall of oak panelling, which none of the others did, and a dear little roll-top desk full of tiny drawers that had belonged to her grandmother, and where she'd once spent many hours pretending to be a serious student. Unlike her elder sister, Elizabeth, who'd been sent away to a fierce school run by nuns, Cassie had been allowed to remain a day girl until at 16 she had decided to board, opting for a small co-ed school where everyone had pets. By then she'd been through her horsey phase and had taken with her a beautiful lop-eared rabbit called Horace, and where getting a part in the school play was given as much praise as doing well in exams. With the mind that retained interesting but not necessarily useful facts, Cassie had acquired respectable exam results without managing anything spectacular. Even now, as a fully fledged grown-up, she struggled to remember who was in charge of which government department and how to work out percentages, and what the names were of all the countries in Eastern Europe. That her 3 elder siblings were all more obviously academic than her was something Cassie had always accommodated with ease, as much a fact of life as the tear-shaped birthmark next to her tummy button and being the only one to have blonde curly hair. Bobbing along as the baby of the family in the less pressurized slipstream of family life, Cassie had watched the highs and lows of her brothers and sisters' faltering advance through adolescence to adulthood with a combination of compassion and curiosity. Particularly Elizabeth's, for there was no doubt that her sister had suffered most. Through a combination of being unhappy at school, arguing with Pamela, a maddening adversary because she never got cross, opting for disastrous hairstyles in the 70s, pudding basin page boys and frizzy unforgiving perms, misguided dalliances with fashion, hot pants, miniskirts, thick multicoloured knee-length socks, and even more misguided dalliances with men. Elizabeth's first marriage to an unemployed journalist called Lucien had lasted 3 years. Her sister had had a very bumpy ride indeed. Cassie had quietly observed it all, finding her sibling, who was 9 years older, easier to love for these struggles, but inwardly determining that she would never endure such public and catastrophic failures herself. Trying to behave as if she wasn't waiting for the phone to ring, Cassie began to fish all the presents out of the bottom of her suitcase and line them up across the bed. A blue cashmere scarf and a book on cooking curry for Elizabeth. She and Colin, her second husband of 14 years, were mad about Indian food. A state-of-the-art chrome corkscrew for her eldest brother Peter. A bland but safe silky grey scarf for his wife Helen, who made a habit of dressing severely even for country walks. A book of after-dinner speeches in a silly tie for Charlie, her other brother, who at 43 was the closest in age to her, and who, in spite of being a civil servant, was the joker of the family. An arty print of some flowers for his wife, Serena, a set of tapestry wool for her mother, and a pair of leather gloves for her father. For Colin, there was a bottle of wine, looking worryingly bubbly from its ride in the bottom of her bag, and for all her nephews and nieces there were cheques, as usual, £15 each, apart from Roland, Elizabeth and Colin's 9-year-old, who was her godson and therefore got 20. The only child for whom she had ventured to buy an actual gift was Tina, Serena and Charlie's 16-month-old, the fourth and youngest of their brood. After much agonising, Cassie had settled on a rag doll with yellow woolen hair and freckles stitched across her nose, which reminded her vaguely of a much-loved dolly she had once had. To give a baby money didn't feel right, she had explained to Serena that afternoon, worrying both about appearing fair to all the children and her choice of toy, which in retrospect seemed a bit unimaginative. Serena had laughed, then said it sounded lovely, and that Tina would probably enjoy the wrapping paper just as much as whatever was inside it. Cassie had laughed too, while hoping secretly that this would not prove the case, since the doll was handmade and had cost rather a lot. Cassie's phone rang when, absorbed in writing gift tags, she had at last forgotten about it. "My darling," she whispered, her heart leaping as it always did at the sound of her lover's voice. "My dearest darling, how are you?" "Missing you." "Me too. Is it awful?" "Fairly." "I can hardly hear you. It's a bad line." "I'm outside, pretending to put the rubbish out. I just had to call you. I miss you so much." "And me. I'm in my room, refuge from children and noise. I wanted to thank you for my present. So sweet. It's only a little thing. A beautiful little thing, like you. I shall treasure it. And you liked mine, didn't you?" Cassie's fingers leapt to the gold necklace concealed under the collar of her shirt. "I love it," she whispered. "And I love you." "I love you too, but I've got to go. I'll call when I can. Think of me tomorrow, our first Christmas." "Of course, my sweetheart, of course." Elizabeth tiptoed backwards out of the room, her eyes fixed upon Roland's sleeping figure. He'd been suffering all week with a streaming cold. Holding her breath, she pulled the door shut behind her, frowning in the direction of the bathroom at the end of the corridor where the splashing and shrieks were reaching a new frenzy. "Sorry to interrupt." She opened the bathroom door just enough to put her head round it. Inside, Serena was kneeling on a sodden bath mat, her long chestnut hair streaming with customary artlessness out of a loose bun, her arms elbow-deep in one of the huge line-footed cast-iron baths which resided in all 4 of the Ashley House bathrooms. The front of her blue jumper was dark with water, and there were pink spots in her cheeks. In front of her, baby Tina, wispy hair plastered to her face, was batting at mountainous suds with both arms, squealing with delight as flecks of foam and water splattered over the sides of the bath and up the tiled walls. "She likes soap, look," announced Chloe, Peter and Helen's 7-year-old, who was perched, looking equally drenched and thrilled, on a stool next to the taps. "Here, Tina, what's this? She even likes licking it, see? She doesn't mind the taste or anything." "Goodness, so she does," murmured Elizabeth, too concerned at the possibility of the rising noise level waking her son to offer anything more enthusiastic, and marvelling, as she so often did, at her sister-in-law's ability not to fret about soap-eating or any of the other worrying things children got up to. Colin said it was because, after 4, she'd got used to anything. But Elizabeth, watching as Serena expertly slid the soap from view and began blowing raspberries on her daughter's pink barrel of a tummy, knew that it went rather deeper than that. That if she herself had ever been courageous or insane enough to produce 3 more offspring, she would have collapsed under the strain, even if they weren't fragile and prone to allergies like Roland. "You couldn't, I hate to ask, but you couldn't keep the noise down just a tiny bit, could you, Serena? Only Roland's full of cold, and I've only just managed to get him to sleep, and if he doesn't get a good night, he'll be so crabby tomorrow and probably ruin everything for everybody." She offered an apologetic smile. "Sorry to be a bore." "It's okay. You should have said sooner. We're making a frightful din, aren't we, my dumpling?" Serena returned her attention to her daughter, widening her eyes and raising her index finger to her lips. "Shh, Bunny, or we'll wake Roland, won't we?" The baby went very silent, transfixed by the sudden solemn face of her mother. "Well, Father Christmas might wake him anyway," put in Chloe. in part wanting to test out a concept about which, thanks to various loose comments made by her big brother Theo and some of the elder cousins, she was having serious doubts. And, in part, wanting to get revenge on the least favourite of her aunts for ruining the fun. It was Christmas Eve, after all, and Roland was always ill. He couldn't even stroke Samson because he said it gave him itchy eyes, though he was always hugging Boots, usually just when Chloe wanted to, which was ridiculous. At least Theo had said it was ridiculous, and although her big brother could be mean, he was also frightfully clever. "When he comes down the chimney," she continued, her voice reedy with uncertainty, "Roland might wake then, mightn't he? I did last year. At least, I did just after he'd gone. The reindeer had eaten the carrots, and I heard his sleigh bells and everything." She paused, feeling important as she always did at this point in her story, fresh conviction at the existence of Father Christmas welling inside. "The sleigh bells might wake Roland too, mightn't they?" "Yes, they might," conceded Elizabeth, her expression softening, although inside she felt helpless. All of the things that were supposed to be fun, like Christmas and birthdays, were precisely the things her own beloved boy seemed to find so hard. Overexcitement of any kind invariably distressed Roland. When she'd taken him as a toddler to visit Father Christmas's grotto in Guildford, he had howled in terror the moment they stepped inside. And when it dawned on him that the same bearded creature was due to tiptoe into his bedroom in the middle of the night, he'd been inconsolable. They'd let him sleep with them that year, squashed hip to hip in the narrow spare bed at Colin's parents' place in Brentwood. After that, the annual challenge of getting the stocking to the end of the bed became not the jokey chore that her brother's family seemed to find it, but an ordeal involving huge stress all round, with Roland terrified he would wake up, and she and Colin arguing into the small hours about whether it was safe to go in and whose turn it was to make the attempt. Against such a background, it had been a positive relief the year before to admit that it was in fact the duty of parents, rather than a team of reindeer driven by a fat man with a bushy beard, to deposit gifts on children's beds. Yet this news, which Roland had seemed to want so badly, had only made him weep in complicated disappointment, triggering one of his headaches and 2 days off school. "Don't worry." Serena had recognised the anxiety in her sister-in-law's face, the jaw set firm and square like her father-in-law's when he was hunched over the business section of the paper, and wanted to be kind. She had learnt long ago that one woman couldn't tell another how to be a mother, especially not a woman like Elizabeth, who, in spite of being intelligent, seemed to have an inbuilt mechanism for believing herself in the wrong. "He'll be fine tomorrow, I'm sure. Ed was hacking like an old man last week, and the twins both brought some dreadful bug home on the last day of term, but they all bounced back pretty quickly. They always do." "Yes." Elizabeth wrung her hands, looking doubtful. She was fond of Serena and would have liked to talk to her some more. Like Charlie, to whom she was enviably well suited, her sister-in-law had a fabulous and refreshing ability to bat away life's problems. The pair of them just did not seem to mind things in the way other people did. They lived surrounded by the inevitable clutter and chaos created by 4 children in an Edwardian terraced house in Wimbledon. Even with a loft conversion, they were very squashed, cupboards visibly bulging and bits of furniture wedged up against each other like ill-fitting pieces of some vast 3-dimensional jigsaw. Maisie and Clem, their 14-year-old twins, had adjoining rooms on the top floor. Their brother Ed, who was 12, had a box room on the landing, while Tina's cot was slotted into the spare bedroom between piles of laundry and old art projects of Serena's, of which there were many. Visiting them, which didn't happen very often these days with her and Colin in Guildford, Elizabeth was always torn between admiration and incredulity at how they managed, not just to live happily, but to find anything. Keeping track of her own modest family's bits and pieces was hard enough, and they lived in a spacious mock Tudor semi with 2 spare bedrooms, an attic and a garage. And he'd been so well too, right up until this week, typical. She tried out a grin, feeling better. She was on holiday, she reminded herself. No screechy violins to listen to for 3 whole weeks. No fidgeting choirs, no grubby grade 5 theory papers with squashed, unreadable chords, their notes like misshapen beetles crawling up the stave. In spite of the severe patches of misery she had experienced as a child, and the still somewhat problematic relationship she had with her mother, Elizabeth found herself drawn back to the family home more and more. The memories of her unsatisfactory youth were still vivid, but so now was the recognition of her sheer good fortune in having such easy access to somewhere as large and beautiful as Ashley House. From the start she had loved bringing Roland there, not just for the glory of giving him so much space to run around in, but also because playing regularly with his cousins provided some relief from the burden of being an only child. They were an alarmingly robust bunch, her brother's children. It tore at Elizabeth's heart sometimes to see Roland's efforts to keep up with them, but by and large they were kind. Poor Roland, it's too bad. Serena had dried Tina and was deftly fitting her into a sleep suit, bending and steering her chubby limbs into the arms and legs. "Do you want to do the poppers?" she asked Chloe, who had moved off her stool and was standing very close to her lap, breathing hard, her big blue eyes shining with hope. "Yes, please." Chloe set about her task with both hands, biting her lips in concentration, wet strands of her thick black hair still glued across her face. "And then can I carry her to bed?" "Of course." Serena, catching Elizabeth's look of concern, smiled. "And then I think we've all earned a drink, don't you? The men are downstairs opening bottles. Maisie and Theo are laying the table, and Pamela is doing 1,000 things in the kitchen and refusing help from everybody as usual. She's a miracle, isn't she, your mother? Charlie always says it's unnatural to like your mother-in-law so much, but I can't help it. If I'm half as capable and beautiful at 73, I shall be completely thrilled. Fat chance, though," she continued cheerfully, talking now over the top of Chloe's head. "On the beauty side of things, anyway. 16 months on, and I've still got this huge spare tyre, look." She let Chloe take full charge of the baby, turned sideways, and gripped what looked to Elizabeth, who'd had curves in all the wrong places long before she'd had Roland, like a modest roll of flesh. "And with this last pregnancy, some more veins exploded on my legs, only small ones, but they're quite hideous." She seized the hem of her skirt and hoiked it round her waist, revealing long socks and shapely white thighs. "There, see?" She stabbed her index finger into her flesh. "And there, and there." Elizabeth could see only a couple of tiny pink spidery veins. She herself had a fat blue river of a blood vessel on the inside of her own thigh that she wouldn't have pointed out to anyone. But Serena had a way of saying anything and making it sound okay. It was entirely her doing, for instance, that everybody knew Tina had been conceived at Ashley House after a particularly merry New Year's Eve family gathering when, as Serena had cheerfully put it, she and Charlie had been too pissed to bother with precautions. Instead of minding, Elizabeth always shuddered to think how Colin would have reacted to her disclosing anything so personal. Charlie had laughed gustily, saying, "And thank God, because Tina was a complete darling and they wouldn't be without her for the world." Tina herself was now dangling at a precarious angle in Chloe's arms. Elizabeth knew it wasn't her business to be worried, but it was hard nonetheless, like a reflex one couldn't control. "She's all right like that, is she?" she blurted, clenching her hands in a bid to restrain herself from reaching for the baby. "Oh, heavens, yes." Serena dropped her skirt. "She gets much more manhandling than that. Chloe's in complete control, aren't you, sweetheart?" Chloe nodded fiercely. "You lead the way, then. Tina's cot is in the little room at the end next to the big green room where Uncle Charlie and I sleep, so we can hear her if she needs us in the night. I'll see you downstairs in a minute," she added to Elizabeth, then trotted to catch up with her niece, who was staggering visibly under the weight of her load. "I'll put her in, shall I?" she said gently as they approached the cot. "And you can wind up the musical box. It plays Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star for hours. Tina loves it." "Does she?" Zoe sighed dreamily. "I'm going to have 6 babies when I'm a mummy and not make any of them go to school." "Really? That will be hard work." "Theo lives at school now and it's horrid, and I've got to one day as well when I'm 11. 11? But that's ages away. Not something to worry about now, especially not on Christmas Eve. Will Father Christmas come to Tina as well? Of course. Where's her stocking then? She eyed her aunt suspiciously. I'll put it out later, when Uncle Charlie and I go to bed. Now we must hurry away before she notices we're gone, while the music is still playing. Look, she's put her thumb in her mouth. That's a good sign. Serena ushered Chloe out of the room, turning the light off, but leaving the door ajar. Downstairs, the sweet smell of poaching salmon filled the kitchen. Pamela Harrison, her fine silvery tresses coiled into a neat French pleat, her apron fastened loosely around her slim waist to protect her silk blouse and skirt from the splash of vegetable water and hollandaise sauce, hummed to herself as she worked. She had listened to the King's College 9 lessons and carols, and the tunes were still with her, swelling like joy inside her chest. For once in Royal David City, she had settled herself in front of the telly, wanting to see the face behind the sound, pouring like an invisible thread of gold from the cherry mouth of the chorister. The boy's pale face and tar-brush hair, so adorable against the starched frill of his rough and red gown, had reminded her of Theo. Although Theo was, in fact, the least musical of her grandchildren, and currently afflicted with a speaking voice that squeaked between octaves, like notes in search of a tune. Poor Theo. 13 was such a difficult age for a boy. Pamela had sipped her tea, remembering vividly Peter and Charlie going through exactly the same adolescent ordeal. She had closed her eyes and must have nodded off for a few minutes, although when the door opened and Theo himself had sidled in, his face flexing in disappointment at the realization that both the room, and more importantly the television, were engaged, she did her best to conceal it, getting briskly to her feet and patting her hair. Do you want to watch something else?
It's okay, Gran, he had muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. I was just looking for the others.
He looked listless, she noticed, clearly searching for something, although Pamela doubted it was really his cousins. Charlie's twin girls were already young women, wearing heels and bras, and in Maisie's case, quite a lot of makeup whenever a pretext presented itself. While their younger brother Ed, at 12, only a year behind Theo, was still very much a boy, full of enthusiasm for simpler pleasures like football and pizza. Theo, with his spotty chin, stringy limbs and screechy voice, was stranded somewhere between, a tadpole on the edge of a pond. It didn't help that he wasn't a handsome child, with a Harrison square jaw and one of those over-earnest faces that looked as if it might grow into itself somewhere around the age of 35. I expect TV is rationed at boarding school, isn't it?
Rather. Not too bad.
Here, she handed him the remote. I've got loads to do anyway.
Would you like some help?
Impressed, Pamela had laughed and told him not at the moment, but she'd ask if she thought of something. She was only truly happy when she was busy, especially in the kitchen. To her, it was the heart of the house, and she loved it, particularly when all the family was staying and needed providing for. It made her feel like the conductor of a huge orchestra for whom only she knew the score. The entire room glowed with warmth and light. On top of a shining blue Aga set into the huge arched recess that had once housed its Victorian ancestors, several saucepans bubbled, releasing spirals of steam that spread like a thin mist beneath the strip lights and timbers overhead. Bunches of dried herbs, strings of onions and garlic hung from hooks scattered between the oak dresser and wall units, their faint scent mingling pleasantly with the aromas of cooking and fresh flowers. A crystal vase of red and white carnations stood in the middle of the kitchen table, a thick oblong of weathered oak almost as old as the house itself, while more slender arrangements of roses, each in scarlet and cream, were slotted into 2 small stone alcoves on either side of the fireplace. Although the table formed the centrepiece of the room, such was the extravagance of the space available that between the walk-in larder and the back wall there was also room for a hefty, mustard-coloured sofa and matching armchair, cast-offs from a previous generation of sitting-room furniture. This cosy corner, lit by a blue ceramic lamp on the windowsill, constituted one of Pamela's favourite refuges. The light from the lamp was gentle, and stacked next to it were all her most thumbed cookery and garden books, together with an ancient sagging coil pot Charlie had made at primary school that housed all sorts of vital implements, like scissors, pens, and a spare pair of glasses. It had taken a while to get the kitchen thus, exactly as she wanted it. Stripped of its accoutrements, it was a vast, potentially austere space, with stone walls, quarried floor tiles, and big plain windows overlooking the measliest of the lawns and the scrawny bit of privet hedge that ran into the upper wall of the vegetable garden. As an area originally designed for the use of servants, it had received little cosseting before her arrival. John's mother, Nancy, a delicate willowy woman with soulful eyes, had performed marvellously at the end of dinner-party tables, but could barely lift a teaspoon to serve herself. She had entered the kitchen only to discuss menus and shopping lists, and had not thought to update it, beyond installing taps to replace the old water pump and an ugly fat beige electric cooker to replace the old stove. During Eric's brief, servantless reign as master of the house, the kitchen had suffered yet more neglect. Pamela retained a particularly vivid image of her brother-in-law standing in front of the beige cooker in a tatty tartan dressing gown, feet bare, cigarette in one hand and frying pan in the other, blithely spattering fat that he had no intention of wiping away. When she and John had moved in, they'd been too strapped for cash to see too much beyond fresh coats of paint and treatments for woodworm and rising damp. It was several years into John's tenure as a Lloyd's member before the Aga saw off the beige cooker, and a friend of Sid's built all the handsome oak cupboards to replace the greasy black shelves. Pamela glided between the sink, the oven, and the table, adding to the array of bowls and plates of food. Centre stage was the Christmas cake, which she had iced and decorated that morning with the little figurines she used every year. 3 fir trees, 2 reindeer, a squat Father Christmas, a church, and 2 golden angels, who were disproportionately large for the scene, but always looked charming anyway, with the dusting of snow on their tiny songbooks and the icing swirling in drifts round the bottom of their gowns. In a white pudding basin next to it, the Christmas pudding glistened. Wrapped in muslin since October, it smelt so strongly and deliciously of brandy and fruit that on peeling off the cover, Pamela had felt the saliva burst inside her mouth. The children, she knew, preferred mince pies and only ate the pudding for the money, thrilled, as only children could be, at the notion of stumbling upon buried treasure, even the little 5-pence pieces which everyone, apart from dear little Tina, knew had been eased inside by Granny with a spoon. But no treasure on John's plate this year, Pamela reminded herself, thinking of her husband's poorly teeth. She turned aside from her cooking and wrote "dentist" across the opening page of her new diary. He would put off doing anything about it himself, and she had seen how he was struggling with his food, steering each mouthful to one side until his cheek bulged, and taking twice as long as usual to clear his plate. She hadn't said anything, of course. The timing was all wrong, with Christmas just a day away. He would have been irritated at having his discomfort observed. But in the peaceful aftermath of January, with Christmas and New Year safely behind them and the house back to themselves, she knew it would be easy to find exactly the blend of compassion and sternness with which to broach the subject. In life, timing was everything, Pamela mused, sliding a knife into the belly of the fish and dropping a fresh sprig of mint into the now boiling potatoes. From cooking to marriage, expertise lay in the ability to seize the right moment to do the right thing. She smiled to herself, pleased at the thought, which had occurred to her before but never so lucidly, and which, like many good thoughts, she decided to keep to herself. She retreated to the sofa and picked up her diary again, which was large with embossed leather corners and illustrated with flowing-haired pre-Raphaelite women to mark the beginning of each month. She opened it at random and smoothed her palms across the crisp white pages, infused for a moment with a sense of all possibilities ahead, as if the skeleton of the year lay under her fingertips. It promised to be a good 12 months. Her children and their families would, as usual, make several visits during half-terms and holidays. Peter was talking of a summer party to celebrate his 50th, and her old friend Dorothy was planning a trip from Boston. And then there was the young man who wanted to write about Eric. A book about war heroes, the letter had said. Unsung war heroes. He had wanted to come before Christmas, but she had put him off. Timing, Pamela thought again, closing the book as her head did one of its whirls, depositing her suddenly and for no particular reason at the notion of sex, which she had once enjoyed, but which she now regarded as one might a dear deceased friend, recalled with fondness rather than loss.
"Can I do anything?"
She looked up to see her eldest daughter-in-law framed in the doorway, her dark hair cropped briskly round her fierce cheekbones and earnest brown eyes. "Helen, how kind." Pamela slipped the diary back into its place on the shelf. "I don't think so, except to call everybody to the dining room. Maisie and Clem did the table. Oh, and I promised Ed he could light the candles. He asked specially." Moments later, the kitchen was filled with people. Charlie looking for sellotape, Peter tugging corks out of bottles, Cassie with wet hair and a towel round her shoulders asking if anyone had seen her hairbrush, and Maisie, self-conscious but radiant in towering heels and sparkling purple eyeshadow smeared like bruises across her pale lids. St. Margaret's, half empty most Sundays of the year, was so full that a few latecomers had to stand at the back. Every time the huge oak doors were opened, the flames of the candles fixed into brass sticks at each end of every pew shivered in protest, threatening to cast the packed congregation into darkness. Clem was standing between her twin sister, who was much taller than her in her heels, and her mother, who looked thrown together but somehow splendid, with a black silk shawl across her shoulders and her hair messily tucked up into a wide-brimmed black hat. Clem was aware of her perfume, a musky scent, which had been the same for as long as she could remember. Her father stood on her other side, his usually jovial face slack with solemnity. His hair, still thick and only faintly peppered with grey, hadn't quite grown into a new haircut and was sticking up a bit at the crown. There were little flecks of dandruff on the shoulders of his overcoat, Clem noticed, and longed to reach across the back of the pew and brush them off. Her eyes moved along the line to light on the figure of her Uncle Peter, lean and imposing in a long dark cashmere coat, his jaw jutting, his bald patch glinting through his thinning mesh of grey hair. Beside him, her Aunt Helen, with her short back and sides hairstyle and dark blue trouser suit, might, at a distance, have passed for a miniature man. She was fidgeting, apparently concerned about keeping her hymn and prayer books in a tidy pile, but glancing all the time at Theo, who was slotted into the pew behind, between their grandparents and Aunt Cassie. The poor boy had been made to wear his new school blazer, which was so huge that the sleeves hung to his fingertips, while the shoulders bulged from all the unoccupied space inside. With such a large group, Elizabeth and Colin had been forced to make do with seats to the far right of the church, where they were half hidden by a stone pillar and a fat woman in a fur coat. The only adult absentee from the service was Aunt Alicia, who had been enticed into remaining at Ashley House in the role of babysitter for the younger ones. Although having seen her wedged among cushions in the deepest of the TV room armchairs, with her sticks propped next to her and the telly on full blast, it had occurred to Clem that the old dear would have trouble hearing an earthquake, let alone anything going on in the bedrooms upstairs. Her Aunt Elizabeth hadn't seemed too happy about it either. At the last minute she had even volunteered to keep Alicia company. But Uncle Colin, whispering fiercely into her ear, had more or less frog-marched her out of the front door. Every time her aunt's face bobbed into view between the pillar and the fat woman's coat, Clem could see that she still looked unhappy. During the hymns she hardly opened her mouth, and when everyone was supposed to have their heads down in prayer, Clem, peeking between her fingers, saw that Aunt Elizabeth's eyes were wide open and staring fixedly ahead, as though her thoughts were a million miles away from the vicar's prayers for the homeless and starving babies. Clem found it obscurely comforting that one of the grown-ups should appear to be as little in the mood for Christmas as she was. Usually, coming to Ashley House triggered a surge of happy feelings, connected not to the prospect of anything specific, so much as a general sense of anticipation. But this time all the familiar things, Granny in her apron fussing over food, jolly questions about school from aunts and uncles, hanging up her smart clothes for Christmas Day, just made her feel flat, like she'd done it all before and there was nothing in the world to look forward to ever again. Her cousins, normally great comrades when they were thrown together, regardless of age or sex, had struck her as either impossibly alien, Theo, or impossibly irritating, Chloe and Roland. So lacking in jollity herself, she had found it hard to believe in any show of such emotions in those around her. Before coming out that night, she'd written in the notebook she kept for her most private thoughts, "Christmas is for hypocrites," underlining the last word because it was a favourite in her burgeoning arsenal of vocabulary, and she was pleased to have found so perfect an opportunity to use it. Maisie, she knew for certain, had only been keen to come to church because she thought it was grown up to stay out till past midnight, and, even more pathetically, because she had believed that the pop star Neil Roscoe might be there. It was true that the man had bought the big manor house on the other side of Barham. Clem had read about it in the paper. But unattached millionaire celebrities were, in her view, unlikely to spend Christmas Eve on their knees in a country church. When she had said as much to Maisie, prompted by the sight of her dolling herself up in front of the little mahogany dressing table in their bedroom, as if she actually had a date with the man, her sister had exploded with righteous indignation, saying just because she liked to make the best of herself, it didn't have to mean it was for the benefit of the opposite sex. Clem had gone very quiet. Thanks to a tousled new sixth-former called Johnny Cottrell, she herself had devoted considerable energy during the course of the previous term to doing just that, bullying her thick dark hair daily with washing and conditioning, and, on occasions, making furtive use of Maisie's eyelash curlers. She'd even gone through a phase of rolling up the waistband of her school skirt to reveal more of her legs, which, unlike the rest of her, had a decent shape. "Sorry," she had breathed the word miserably. She didn't often quarrel with her sister, and to do so on Christmas Eve, when the nameless wretchedness had taken residence in her heart, was almost more than she could bear. The pair of them were very different in looks. Maisie was slim with chestnut hair like their mother, while Clem was thicker set with her father's darker colouring and personality, but also fiercely close. At one stage they had even developed a bit of a secret language, until Ed got the hang of it, and then there no longer seemed any point. "Me too. Friends? Friends. I've got you a gorgeous present, Clem. I just know you'll love it." Clem had smiled, thinking of her own gift, a pair of glittering lilac earrings nested in a cotton wool box so tiny that she had feared, dropping it into the ocean of presents already swamping the laden Norwegian pine downstairs, that it might never be found. "And you'll like yours, I promise." "Want some of this?" Maisie, in awe of her own generosity, held out the new and much-prized box of sparkling purple eyeshadow. "I mean it, honestly." "No, I won't, but thanks." "It is exciting, though, isn't it?" Maisie threw herself onto her sister's bed, scissoring her legs as she talked. "I mean, of all the places in the world Neil Roscoe could have bought a house, and he goes and chooses Barham. When I told Monica Simmons, she was so jealous she almost wet herself. She practically cries when she sees a picture of him. I mean, I think he's quite good-looking and everything, but it's his music I'm really into. He's pretty talented, you've got to admit." "Oh, sure," agreed Clem, although the great Roscoe's tunes were far too obvious for her to get really excited about them. But the sisterly truce was going well, and she hadn't wanted to blow it off course. She could write what she really thought later in her secret notebook, she decided now, sneaking a look at her watch to see how long the vicar had been talking, and musing on what a simple, perfect receptacle a private sheet of paper was for any honesty, no matter how brutal. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth touched Colin's sleeve. Since they had arrived at Ashley House that afternoon, she had been aware of him retreating into himself, away from her. She wondered if he was still brooding about the promotion fiasco that had overshadowed the end of term. He had got the job of deputy head, only to find that he would be sharing the post with Phyllis McGill, the abrasive head of physics, with whom he had never got on.
Fine.
He patted her hand, keeping his gaze fixed on the altar where the vicar was now preparing the wafers for Holy Communion. She could see the vein in his temple pulsing above the dark limb of his glasses, just where his thin grey hair met his face. "And I'm sure Roland's all right," she whispered, hoping both for his forgiveness over her earlier anxiety and to remind him that it was Christmas when the happiness of their son should be paramount. "I've got the stocking all ready. It should be easy."
Great.
Colin patted her hand again. He'd been thinking not of their son or of Phyllis McGill, but of a conversation during dinner with his brothers-in-law about wine. Of course, it was always about something like that, wine or sport, with Peter making a show of seeking others' opinions, but only as a pretext for voicing his own. What did Colin think of the Saint-Laurent? Colin, his thoughts lurching to the 5 bottles of Sainsbury's own label that constituted his own wine stocks, had said, what else, that it struck him as very pleasant. Whereupon Peter had launched into one of his diatribes about grapes and soil types, until Charlie had banged him on the back and said he was being a bore and nothing mattered except the stuff tasting good and hitting the spot. Colin had been grateful, but not particularly consoled. When he had first made the acquaintance of his brothers-in-law some 14 years before, their friendliness had caused him to overlook the fact that they belonged to an invisible club from which he would always be excluded. A club based on public school and privilege, and a form of inner self-belief for which Colin had striven in far more laborious ways. He tried not to mind. The Harrison family always endeavoured to make him feel welcome, bent over backwards, in fact, which sometimes made it worse. Like Charlie bailing him out like that, telling Peter to shut up because he knew Colin was out of his depth, saying what Colin would have given anything to be able to say himself, but which he never could because at the end of the day he was still an outsider, without the luxury of the confident insouciance that Charlie had, that they all had, apart from Elizabeth, who had grasped at him all those years ago, like an insect clinging to a blade of grass. "Darling, everyone's standing."
"Sorry."
Colin gripped the back of the pew in front and hauled himself to his feet, smiling in fierce defiance at the embarrassment of having been caught one step behind. Roland dreamed he was swimming. It was mostly a nice dream, scary because the water was dark and cold, but nice because he was gliding and weightless, and because although he'd been holding his breath for hours, it didn't hurt. In the water he was strong and powerful, like a fish, like Theo and Ed, who had races across the lake in the summer, not minding its iciness or the thought of the creatures underneath. Nameless, shapeless, slimy things that brushed against one's shins and toes. In the dream, the water was getting less dark, but colder too. He was swimming towards something, a light maybe, and he wanted to reach it badly, so badly that it hurt but felt wonderful at the same time, just knowing that he was going to arrive there if only he could hang on a little longer. And then his lungs started to hurt, and his tummy too, and he wanted to cry out, but no sound would come out, because he hadn't reached where he was going. Just as he thought he would explode with aching, there was a sense of wonderful release. A moment of relief followed before he was suddenly wide awake, with the tick of the clock on the bedroom mantelpiece and a terrible warm wetness between his legs. His pyjama bottoms, sheets, and even part of the pillowcase was soaking. For a few minutes Roland lay very still, torn between the urge to cry out for his mother and a gut-wrenching sense of shame. He had wet his bed before and been told many times by Elizabeth that it did not matter, that it was something some children did, that sheets could be washed, that it was just something that happened from time to time. But it did matter, Roland knew, because of his father's jokes about putting him back in nappies, and because on the rare occasion he had been invited to stay overnight at friends' houses, he had refused, for fear of committing the same crime in another family. It was a few minutes before he had assembled his thoughts sufficiently to recall that he was at his grandparents' house, and it was Christmas Eve. Trying to ignore the wetness of his pyjamas and bedclothes, now horribly cold and sticking to his skin, he gingerly slid his feet from side to side, searching for the weight and rustle of a full stocking, unsure if he wanted it to be there or not. If it wasn't there, his parents had yet to come in. If it was, they would be asleep in the next room, beyond consolation or disapprobation until morning. Roland wasn't sure which would be worse. He could feel nothing with his feet, so he gripped the edge of the bed and peered over the side. Because of being ill, he had been put on his own, instead of sharing one of the lovely big top-floor bedrooms with Ed and Theo. This room was square and very small, having once served as a dressing room to the bedroom next door where his parents were. There was just enough space for the bed, a chair, and a small chest of drawers, on top of which sat a large white porcelain bowl with a matching jug. There had been for washing in the olden days, before taps and basins, and he was to be careful not to break them, his mother had explained, as she folded his clothes and tucked him up. Roland, his head thick with cold and a sense of gross injustice at being herded into bed before even the youngest of his cousins, had said he thought it was dumb that a jug and bowl could be so special. But now, seeing the white glow of the porcelain in the dark, he thought it did look sort of special, and, if he screwed his eyes up, like a huge white bird, a ghostly swan, gliding through the pitch black of the room. Below, propped against the chest of drawers, was his small holdall of clothes, and, leaning against that, he saw suddenly, his heart clenching, was a bulging version of Uncle Eric's large woolen sock, one of several relics from his days in the army, which traditionally served as Christmas stockings for all the grandchildren, which had been draped across the end of his bed a few hours before. Which meant his parents were indeed asleep on the other side of the connecting door. Roland toyed for one last brief moment with the idea of fetching his mother, then decided finally against it. She would be kind, she always was, but his father would be cross. Coming into their bedroom in the middle of the night, like wetting sheets and crying when he fell over, was something he was supposed to be growing out of. Because he was 9 1/4 and had to learn to be brave, Roland reminded himself, biting his lower lip, which was trembling and threatening to let him down. He hugged his damp pillow to his chest, crawled to the other end of the bed, tugged all the bedding out from the mattress and wriggled down inside. If he kept his legs to the left with his knees bent up to his chest, he couldn't feel the wetness in the sheets. And the pillow wasn't too bad either, turned the other way up and upside down. There was a smell, sort of sweet, but not very nice, although it was hard to be sure of anything through the thickness of his cold. In a few minutes he was asleep again, breathing heavily through his mouth and emitting little squeaky wheezes with the rise and fall of his chest. At Christmas, the dining room came into its own. Of all the rooms in Ashley House, it was by far the grandest. Generally passed over in favour of the kitchen, where the old oak table could easily accommodate huge numbers, it had been sufficiently underused and unassailed by modern furnishings to retain all the elegant formality of earlier times. A long mahogany dining table, with rounded corners and flamboyant pedestal legs, held centre stage, with a large crystal chandelier suspended from an elaborate ceiling rose by a heavy brass chain. Oil paintings, including a couple of stiff portraits of Albert and Nancy Harrison, were ranged round the walls, illuminated by gleaming brass picture lights. Between them, sprouting like flowers, were several delicate pairs of wall lights with tulip-shaped glass shades and curvy brass stems. The curtains were of burgundy velvet, matching the wine red of the carpet and setting off to perfection the sumptuous damask cream wallpaper and the dark polished wood of the furniture. With an antique shop's worth of silver and crystal adorning the table, the effect was spectacular. Even Tina's high chair had been laid with a crisp folded dove of a napkin and a tiny silver spoon and fork. Helen, entering the room with a dish of bread sauce in one hand and a silver gravy boat in the other, paused to take in the scene, struck, as she was from time to time, by the effortless magnificence of the family into which she had married. Her own family had money, but, as she had realised when she met Peter during her final year at law school, absolutely no equivalent sense of style or history. When her father retired, her parents had moved to a bungalow near Plymouth, which was sizable but soulless, and housed their accumulated hodgepodge of possessions without any obvious affection or cohesion. The garden surrounding the bungalow was large and might have been attractive were it not for the cumbersome presence of the caravan in which they liked to holiday. Family ancestors were rarely mentioned, and only in passing. Consequently, Helen had little sense of where she came from, other than in purely geographical terms, nor that it mattered particularly. In contrast, Peter's sense of family was immense, his pride in his pioneering ancestors almost palpable. To be invited to become a part, even an important part, of such a clan, so reverential of the past and still functioning so well in the present, had given Helen an unprecedented and inspiring sense of self-definition. It was only as the years passed that she had learned it could be overwhelming too at times, when she wasn't in the mood, or when, as was occurring with increasing frequency these days, Peter talked in sweeping terms of the time when Ashley House would pass into their own hands. The nearing of this once distant prospect made Helen, fearless about most things, rather afraid. Pamela would be a hard act to follow, particularly for a woman like her with a full-time job as a lawyer and no feel for country life. Sharing such apprehensions with her husband, however, was proving difficult. Just the night before they had argued about it, after midnight mass too, which somehow made it worse, when Helen, exhausted from a week that had stretched her energies almost to breaking point, work deadlines, Christmas shopping, school carol services, threats of resignation from their irksome Turkish au pair, had been misguided enough to seek reassurance on the subject. "I don't know how your mother manages. I'd need an army of helpers if I lived down here."
"Would you? Why?"
"Oh, Peter, you know why." Helen flopped onto the stool in front of the long cherrywood dressing table next to their bed, peering warily at her pallid reflection in its gleaming oval mirror. "Commuting to London and trying to keep the place nice, the garden and so on." She screwed the lid off her night cream and dabbed several blobs on strategic places across her face.
"Sid helps with the garden?"
"Sid won't live forever."
"Son of Sid, then?"
"He hasn't got a son. He's got a daughter who lives miles away and who has that dreadful child, Jessica, who's always coming to stay and pushed Chloe into all those brambles last year."
"Really, Helen, stop being so literal, would you?"
Peter offered his wife an eye roll of despair, then stepped into the bathroom and switched on his electric toothbrush. The conversation was suspended for a few minutes, the tension it had created visible only in the angry dabbing of Helen's fingertips across her face and the unnatural thoroughness with which her husband steered the vibrating bristles round his teeth. There was an audible click as he slotted his toothbrush back into its portable holder.
"My parents have always managed without an army of helpers," he continued, emerging from the bathroom. "Your mother was at home all day, without a nanny and twice the number of children to look after." "I won't give up my job," Helen had snapped, prompted by a sudden terrifying image of being buried in the countryside all day with no one to talk to but Labradors and gardeners. Her face was shining slightly from too much cream. A few specks had caught the edges of her hair, lending a greasy sheen to her sideboards. It was a convenient, if not especially flattering cut to which she had resorted after Theo was born, when the time pressures of getting both herself and a baby presentable by 7 o'clock in the morning had precluded anything involving a hairdryer. "Of course you won't give up your job." Peter sounded both despairing and exasperated. "I've never suggested otherwise. Look, Helen, I haven't the foggiest why we're arguing. All I said was that, in the extremely unfortunate event of my mother and father's demise, I would prefer to run Ashley House informally, as they have, without a posse of staff. Instead of getting hot under the collar about it, we should perhaps focus instead on our good fortune. My dear siblings, as you know, will inherit nothing like the equivalent value of this place. I know. This too was a well-worn subject. Peter, as the firstborn, would get Ashley House. The others would divide up their parents' liquid assets, estimated to be around $1 million, once the taxman had taken his share. No one, therefore, would suffer too badly. "And of course I'm grateful," muttered Helen. "We're agreed on that, then," he replied briskly, tugging back the bed covers. "Besides, in a few years Chloe, with a little cajoling, will also be at boarding school, which will simplify things all round, won't it?" "Yes." Unconsoled, Helen had mouthed the word, watching in the mirror as her husband clambered into bed and reached for his book. These days, boarding school was a subject on which she felt as confused as the prospect of their inheritance. It hadn't always been so. Indeed, for a long time the plan of sending the children away to be educated had seemed like the answer to her dreams. The answer, indeed, to every career mother's relentless juggling act. The 6 years separating the births of Helen's children bore testimony to the constant and supreme effort of managing a job and a family. The decision to allow the conception of Chloe when she was 40 years old had been one of the most difficult she had ever taken. The pregnancy was fraught and draining, but she had rushed back to the firm of lawyers where she worked 6 weeks after the birth, desperate to prove to herself, openly articulating her longing for the day when boarding school would take some of her domestic responsibilities off her hands. As the day approached for Theo to start at St. Peter's, however, Helen began to feel rather differently. By the time they had to say goodbye, she was a wreck. Even now, recalling the tight desperation in her son's big square face as she finally released him, the crimson tips of his ears, the tug of his lower lip as he turned back toward his dormitory, where several intimidatingly large boys had started a pillow fight, brought tears to her eyes. Back in Barnes, the house had felt hollow and somehow unbalanced. Instead of getting on better, she and Chloe, always the more prickly, emotionally complicated child, seemed to spend most evenings bickering about everything: table manners, homework, music practice, television. Rushing home to relieve the au pair, Helen would often wonder, guiltily, why she had bothered. Sitting alone on the sofa in quiet moments between such wearing confrontations and Peter's return from the office, she would find herself longing for Theo's easy bear hugs, with such a physical hunger sometimes that she thought she might be going mad. Peter, himself the happy product of a public school education, was kind but essentially uncomprehending of her anguish. It would pass, he said, as it had for his mother and millions of other women. She should concentrate on Chloe, who needed a lot of concentrating upon, and try not to be sentimental. Almost harder than anything for Helen was that the boy who returned from St. Peter's looked and seemed so different from the one she had sent away. Not just because he was taller and bulkier, with a faint oiliness displacing the fresh apple look of his skin and a rumble in his once sweet treble of a voice, but, harder still, because there was a new aura of distancing self-consciousness about him, a distance that Helen could not, and knew she should not, try to cross. On the odd occasion that he did put his arms round her, she wanted to squeeze him till his ribs cracked. She wanted to say, "This is me, your mother. Remember me and the love I have?" It was like the end of a love affair, Helen thought now, gripping the handle of the gravy boat, tears pricking her eyes as she watched Theo laughing with Maisie about something at the far end of the table. Her son no longer loved her in the way he had and never would. The mother passion of his boyhood was over. "Thank you, Helen." Pamela took the dishes from her hands and set them down on the table. "There's more of both in the kitchen if we need it. Are you all right, dear?" Yes, quite all right, Helen replied, her voice dry, touched yet unnerved that her mother-in-law should have spotted her distraction. I'm a little tired, but then we all are, aren't we? She continued brightly, smoothing her skirt under her thighs as she slipped into a seat between Charlie and Colin, fielding inquiries about whether their children had enjoyed their stockings and how long they were planning to stay. After lunch, there was a frenzy of present opening, followed by a rather less enthusiastic assault on the washing up, which eventually resulted in the women shooing the men and children from the kitchen and getting on with it themselves. Happy to be evicted, the group drifted back into the drawing room, the younger members returning to closer examinations of their gifts, while the men cradled glasses of port and lolled in armchairs, easing their belt buckles. John turned on the television for the Queen's speech, but only Aunt Alicia showed any sign of listening to it. Colin, Peter and Charlie, meanwhile, fell into a discussion about terrorism, triggered by the news of another suicide bomber in Palestine and recent claims by the American president that the war on extremist factions was being won. I'm only saying they're kidding themselves if they think they can wipe it out. It doesn't matter how many tanks or SAS teams go into these areas, there'll always be budding new Osama bin Ladens to take up the cause. It's like some monstrous hydra. Cut off one bit and another grows just as quickly. And so many of the hotspots, Iraq, Afghanistan and so on, are a topographical nightmare too, Charlie endeavoured, without complete success, to suppress a burp. I certainly wouldn't fancy trying to find my way around all those caves and mountains on my belly in the dark with a compass and 30 tons of gear in a backpack. The ethics are interesting, though, don't you think? Ventured Colin. It's essentially about a clash of cultures, isn't it? The Taliban are just one of several extremist religious groups who see Western civilization as the enemy. Who's to say we're right and they're wrong? The question, which had triggered some lively debates in the classroom during the course of the year, proved less effective with his brothers-in-law. Of course we're bloody well right, snorted Peter. 2 years ago they murdered several thousand people in one of the most heinous attacks the world has ever seen. I'm only saying... I knew 5 people in those towers, growled John, an observation they had all heard many times before, but which prompted a moment of silent respect nonetheless. An insurance syndicate, good men, all of them, wives and families. Half the bloody company wiped out. Horrific. Truly horrific, echoed Colin, fearful of having cast himself accidentally in the role of terrorist sympathiser and wanting to atone for it. Well, I thought she was very good this year. Pardon, sorry, Alicia? Peter set down his empty port glass and reached between their armchairs to pat his aunt's arm. Who was good? The Queen. I thought she was very good this year. Very good indeed, he agreed heartily, catching the eye of Charlie, who was chuckling. Just the right tone, and all that trouble she's had, too. She's a marvel. What trouble is that, Alicia? Said Charlie, raising his voice for the benefit of his aunt, who was very deaf. With her family, the poor creature, all their comings and goings. No sense of duty these days. She's the only one with honour and decency, apart from her dear mother, of course. Now, there was a special lady. I remember her during the war, you know. Alicia pulled a small folded handkerchief from her sleeve and pressed it to the tiny folds of flesh at the corners of her lips, where a few stray crumbs of Christmas pudding were still lodged. Visiting London in the Blitz. She was like an angel, bringing hope to the people. And how old would you have been then? Enquired Colin genially, wanting to show that, unlike the poor old lady's nephews who were exchanging schoolboy looks of sufferance, he was truly interested. That's not for you to know, young man, replied Alicia tartly, thereby dashing Colin's hopes of impressing anybody and causing Charlie almost to fall off the sofa, he was laughing so much. Alicia, oblivious to this back row amusement, tucked her handkerchief back under the cuff of her cardigan and reached for her stick. What I need is another cup of tea, though I shouldn't. It goes straight through me, you know. Here, let me get it, exclaimed Charlie, who was actually very good with his aunt and rather fond of her brusqueness. He leapt to his feet and seized her cup and saucer with a gallant flourish. Unless you like a drop of port instead, Heavens, no! Clearly delighted, Alicia fluttered her fingers at him. Charles, you bad boy, the very idea, after all that wine. I should be high as a kite. I means you're on drugs, put in Ed, who happened to be passing the armchair on his skateboard. Clutched to his chest was an advanced form of weaponry called a BB gun, which he'd been given for Christmas. Having studied the instructions, he was en route out of the mayhem of torn wrapping paper still littering the drawing room in search of a suitable spot for some target practice. Lovely, dear, said Alicia, glad to have been addressed by one of the children, even though she hadn't the faintest idea what the boy had said. She got confused with their names and ages, too, and whether they played trumpets or violins, and where they went to school. In her monthly bridge group, she was always talking about her brother and his family, feeling genuine delight in the knowledge of their existence, not to mention a faintly competitive urge to stir envy in the hearts of her companions. Yet the reality of them, the reality of anything, in fact, remained somewhat harder to enjoy. En masse, such a large group of people was noisy and demanding, full of fast talk that she couldn't follow and references to things she didn't understand. Charlie was sweet and Pamela was kind, sometimes suffocatingly so. But she often wondered whether the monumental effort of the journey from her cottage in Wiltshire, a taxi and 2 trains, was really worthwhile. The uncomfortable truth, barely acknowledged by her and certainly not admitted to the bridge group, was that, widowed and with her only son Paul living in Australia, she didn't really have any options. "Isn't he too young to have a gun?" she added, responding to a need to assert herself and addressing the comment to Colin because he was the only one still looking in her direction. "He certainly is." Colin spoke tightly, unsettled by both his thwarted attempts at a decent conversation with any member of his wife's family and a mess-up over Roland's present, a metal detector, which Elizabeth had wrapped without including the necessary batteries. That she could have forgotten something so elementary was maddening. "But it's not a real gun, it fires plastic pellets. We gave Roland a metal detector," he began, seeking some congratulation for the idea of the gift in spite of their failure to get the thing functioning. But he was interrupted by Charlie returning with a fresh cup of tea, which he carefully set down on the table next to Alicia's chair, announcing as he did so that she was the prettiest aunt he had, and if she got whisked off down the aisle again, he wanted to be the first to know. Alicia tutted delightedly, then fell asleep, her tea undrunk, her veiny feet propped on a box of 3-dimensional chess which somebody had given somebody else, swelling out of her smart shoes. In an armchair across the room, John, too, was asleep, his mouth slack, the biography of Colonel H. Jones that Peter had given him open on his chest. "I'm going to walk the ancient hound," declared Peter, getting up from his chair and stretching as he glanced around the room for support. "Any takers?" Pamela appeared in the doorway behind him, carrying a tea towel. "Don't be too long, dear. Sid's dropping by and I want him to take a photograph of all of us." On hearing this news, Ed slipped out of the door leading onto the cloisters, followed by Roland, who knew he wasn't particularly wanted, but who was so desperate to be given a turn with the gun that he didn't care. Disappointment still burned in his 9-year-old heart, not just because of the batteries, but because he had been defeated by daunting books of instructions to 2 construction kits and had eaten so much chocolate he felt sick. "A photo?" Peter clicked his fingers at Boots, who twitched, then heaved himself out from under John's feet, his tail thumping in expectation. "Yes, a photo. It will be lovely. All 3 generations of the family together. I'll make him take several to be sure at least one comes out well." Pamela's voice was no nonsense, communicating to all those present that it was a matter on which she would not be thwarted. A far grander plan, to have just such a photograph used as the basis for a family portrait, she had decided, for the time being, to keep to herself. It was to be a present for John's 80th birthday in the autumn, and she wanted it to be a complete surprise. Clem, scowling at the idea of a photograph, crept out of the drawing room and raced upstairs to her bedroom to write with trembling reverence on the first page of the brand-new leather-bound 5-year diary she had been given by her sister. I don't know how I could have been sad before, because right now I feel so glad. I've had the best year ever for presents. Maisie gave me this diary, which I'm going to write in every day for the next 5 years of my life. It has a key, so I can write anything. Everyone has been really nice, especially Aunt Cassie, who said she thought my hair looked really pretty, though I can't think why because I'd only washed it. And Theo, who was being sort of all stuck up at first, but is now his normal self again. He got this amazing video camera from Uncle Peter and Aunt Helen. Mum says they're spoilt, and I suppose they are, except that spoilt should mean behaving horribly, and Theo and Chloe don't really do that. At least Chloe does sometimes, but that's mostly because she's only 7. Anyway, what I was going to say was Theo got this idea that he was going to do interviews with everyone on his camera, sort of like a documentary, he said, and he chose to do me first. It was a real laugh, though I thought I looked pretty dumb when he played it back to me afterwards. Must stop now, as I can hear someone coming. P.S. Have eaten so much. Feel so fat, I never want to eat another thing. You're looking so well, Cassie, remarked Serena, draping her damp tea towel over the Arga rail and sinking down into the kitchen sofa next to her sister-in-law. Yes, isn't she? Agreed Helen, joining them with her cup of tea. Now that the drama of lunch and presents was over, she could feel herself beginning at last to relax. Theo had given her a dear little box he had made in carpentry, and Chloe a crayoned self-portrait with the words, "I love Mummy," scrawled underneath. Peter, too, had been very sweet, refusing to admit that the suede jacket she had given him was a little too large, and kissing her with a tenderness she knew was designed to communicate that the disagreement of the night before was behind them. Christmas was nothing but a bloody strain, she decided, taking the remaining space on the sofa and blowing across the steam of her tea. So work's going well then, Cassie? Oh, yes, very well indeed, Cassie gushed, flushing at the compliments of her sisters-in-law, wishing she could tell them that the radiance beaming out of her had nothing to do with the number of commissions she had to decorate people's houses, and everything to do with being in love, really in love, for the first time in her life. Nothing she had ever felt for another human being came close. It was 10 months now since she had met Dan, at his surgery, although he wasn't the doctor she'd been seeing, so it wasn't unethical. And her heart still galloped at the mere thought of him. It galloped even more when she saw him. And when he touched her with his cool, expert, slim fingers, she was at times so close to ecstasy that she wanted to weep with the joy of it. She kept waiting for the bubble to burst, for him to say or do something that would jolt her back to the sanity of realizing she was better off alone, a regular occurrence that had triggered the death throes of every other relationship she had ever had. But it didn't happen. No wonder people noticed. It was as if 10,000 light bulbs had been switched on inside her. She felt energized, beautiful, empowered. Given half a chance, she would have gladly shinned up St. Margaret's spire with a loudspeaker to proclaim her happiness to the whole world. The moment they were properly, openly together, she might do just that, Cassie decided, pressing the rim of her mug to her lips to hide her smile. In the meantime, she had to be the soul of discretion, for Dan's sake. He'd wanted to get Christmas out of the way before he told his wife, and she respected him for that. There were his children to consider, after all, 2 girls and a boy, all under 10, and the question of money, about which he was consulting a lawyer friend. In fact, I'm not very busy, she confessed, but the jobs I'm doing I'm enjoying enormously. In truth, her meetings with Dan, grabbed at odd hours and often at very short notice, meant the number of clients on her books had fallen considerably. There's one in Battersea that's particularly challenging, a flat at the top of a Victorian mansion block which was gutted by a fire, so I've been given carte blanche to start again. Who caught fire? Asked Elizabeth, returning from a final fruitless quest for the right-size batteries in various drawers and cupboards suggested by her mother. Not being able to try out the metal detector had made Roland cry, and she felt all the failure of it. She felt, too, the weight of her husband's displeasure, dense and invisible, like the sort of heaviness in the air before a huge storm. She perched on the edge of the kitchen table, folding her arms and smiling at her little sister, looking so like an angel, with a lamp on the shelf behind the sofa shining through the blonde waves of her hair. How simple life is for her, she thought fondly, with only her own happiness to worry about. Boyfriends had come and gone over the years, but were rarely mentioned and even more rarely introduced. There was certainly something selfish about such an existence, but also something admirably brave. Elizabeth herself had never quite believed in her ability to face the world alone, longing, even as a teenager, even after the souring of her first marriage, for the safe haven of a partnership. Just one of my clients, or rather their flat, a spark from some out-of-date wiring or something, but no one was hurt and I've been given a big budget to redecorate. There's some tea in the pot if you want. Has Mum had some? No, she's worrying about this photograph. She's got a real bee in her bonnet about it. Poor old Sid, getting landed when all he really wants is his Christmas bottle of scotch, and it's going to take ages to round everybody up. The children have scattered, and I saw Aunt Alicia sneaking back to the barn with a box of Turkish Delight under her arm. God, she's a miserable old back, isn't she? Except with Charlie, she adores him. That's because he flirts with her, put in Serena. Old ladies love to be flirted with. I suppose because it makes them feel young again. What's flirting? Inquired Chloe, popping up next to the sofa. Never you mind, began Helen. But Serena, speaking over her, said that it was trying to get people to notice you and think you were pretty. But not in a good way, added Helen quickly, spotting the sparkle of happy recognition in her daughter's face and wanting to crush it. It's a bit like showing off. Serena, feeling for Chloe, who was looking both puzzled and crestfallen, got up from the sofa, saying that if they were all to be on parade for Sid, she ought to wake Tina from her afternoon nap. And I could do with some help changing her nappy, she added, eyeing her niece. But I warn you, it might be a bit smelly. Oh, yucky! Shrieked Chloe, making no secret of her delight. Thank God I'm through all that baby business, said Helen with a sigh after the two had gone. Food and drink in one end and out the other. They're just bivalves, really, aren't they? All that mopping up mothers have to do. I suppose, looking back, it's not actually for that long, though at the time it does seem endless. Doesn't it just? Murmured Elizabeth, toying with and rejecting the idea of mentioning Roland's sodden sheets, at that moment whirling round in the tumble-dryer in the utility room at the end of the passage. It seemed cruel to blurt out his problems to the whole world. Pamela knew, and that was bad enough. When she had spotted the stripped bed that morning, her mother had suggested that it might be time to consult a doctor, which, while sensible and well-intended, had stirred ancient resentments in Elizabeth's already troubled heart. She had never been good enough, never getting it right enough. Battling to turn the mattress, she had marvelled at how quickly, how violently, the old feelings could sear through her, as if 30 seconds rather than 30 years separated her from the debilitating sense of inadequacy that had underpinned the turbulence of her teens. Of course Roland should have grown out of such habits, and, as his mother, she felt all the burden of being the one who should know how to assist him in doing so. According to family legend, she and her siblings were all potty-trained by 13 months. Washing nappies were such a bore, Pamela claimed, that it had been the only thing to do. As if all it had taken was a steely click of the fingers. As if that was all it should take Elizabeth. If only she could click hard enough and in the right way. Well, I shall be quite hopeless at absolutely anything to do with babies, declared Cassie cheerfully, unaware both of her sister's dilemmas and of the fact that, for the first time in her 37 years, she had used the future tense rather than the conditional to address the notion. As several had predicted, the photograph took a while to set up. Peter took charge of the operation, while Pamela talked Sid through the mechanics of pressing the right button. After some debate, mostly with himself, Peter settled upon the drawing-room sofa as the ideal focal point round which the group should assemble, instructing the tallest members to stand behind, himself, Charlie, Colin and Theo,
the oldest to sit on the sofa, Alicia, John and Pamela, and the youngest to assume various poses at their feet on the carpet. The remaining group, who fitted into none of these categories, the twins, Elizabeth, Cassie, Serena and Helen, he directed to the sides of the sofa. Maisie and Clem perched on each arm while the women stood at their shoulders. It made for an impressive group, as Sid said many times, frowning more wrinkles into his creased old face and trying to keep his stout, calloused fingers steady on the button. They posed for several shots, during which baby Tina, resplendent in a new pink toweling baby grow, was passed along the rows like a parcel, landing finally with Cassie, who held her stiffly at first, and then more snugly as the child, latching all 10 fingers onto her big beaded necklace, relaxed in her arms. All the children were patient and cooperative apart from Maisie, who, worried that her aunt would smell the cigarette smoke on her hair and clothes, Uncle Peter, stamping around the garden with the dog, had almost stumbled right into her, kept tossing her head and saying what a drag it was. When Theo pleaded with them all not to move while he fetched his video camera, she groaned until silenced by a stern look from her father. "But then you won't be in the picture, Theo," squealed Chloe, who was thoroughly enjoying sprawling on the carpet, shouting "cheese" every 5 seconds and keeping a firm grip on Boots's collar. Slumped with exhaustion from his walk at John's feet, right on top of his shoes to be exact, the dog didn't need holding. But Chloe, feeling proud and powerful, couldn't resist the chance to lay claim to him. "It doesn't matter that I'm not in it," Theo assured his sister when he returned a few moments later with the lens of his camera glued to his right eye. Behind him, Sid was shrinking back into the room, dreading a request either to pose with the family or to handle this infinitely more complicated piece of equipment. "Any decent documentary maker has to remain outside his subject, be objective and so on." There was a ripple of exchanged looks, some among the grown-ups of admiration and some among his cousins of baffled toleration. "Just get on with it," hissed Maisie, breaking off to yelp with pain as her tiny sister, bored with Cassie's necklace, seized a clump of her hair. "Ow, Jesus, bloody hell, Tina!" "Maisie," growled Charlie, who had a post-lunch headache. "That's quite enough." "It hurt. My leg's gone to sleep." "Well done, Theo. I think that will do," purred Pamela, rising from her seat to restore calm. "Thank you, all of you, and to you, dear Sid, so kind." She floated across the room and looped her arm through his to steer him from the room, knowing that without such assistance her employee, especially when he was full of mulled wine and good cheer, sometimes found it hard to make his own way to the front door. "Love to Vera. Is Jessica coming to stay this holidays? Oh, good. Well, do send her round whenever you want, won't you? The more the merrier, as far as the children are concerned. Isn't that right, children?" "Yes," they chorused, not catching each other's eyes because they all hated Sid's granddaughter, even though they were supposed to feel sorry for her because her father had run off with a barmaid and her mother, as Pamela frequently put it, couldn't cope. "Of course, Granny." They kept their laughter in until Pamela had left the room and their parents had drifted out of earshot, drawn by someone's suggestion of more tea. Then they all exploded, united properly for the first time that holiday by the invisible bond of antipathy against a common enemy. "You're a stinking rude boy!" shrieked Theo, imitating Jessica's whining falsetto, and all 6 children collapsed on the floor, holding their bellies and rolling with laughter. Ed seeing suddenly that Theo hadn't transformed into a pompous git after all. Chloe feeling for once blissfully old and included. Roland truly forgetting the ignominy of his wet bed. Clem thinking that this was what she had needed to get finally and thoroughly into the Christmas mood, and Maisie deciding that, as a form of recreation, smoking cigarettes alone by the manure heap had its limitations. January. Pamela had packed carefully for her visit to Eric. As always, she used her big black leather handbag, of which she was not particularly fond, but which had enough wide compartments to accommodate all the normal essentials, together with a book, glasses, needlework, and 2 bumper bags of sherbet lemons. Although he was unable to speak, Eric still took great pleasure in food, particularly sweets, and most particularly sherbet lemons. His appetite was probably why he had lived so long, the nurses said. But his once broad, muscled frame, confined for so many years to beds and wheelchairs, was sagging and shrunken, as if caving in on what was left of the body inside. As fragile as a birdcage, thought Pamela now, hugging him gently and feeling the spokes of his ribs press against her chest. She released him and stroked his hair, which was thick and white, thinking as she always did how incongruous, how cruel it was to have so much healthy growth on top of a face that was already more skull than skin. He had excellent teeth, too, for his age, in spite of the sweets, although the huge smiles with which he had once shown them off were a thing of the past. He looked, if anything, more alert than he had at Christmas, when perhaps he'd been overwhelmed by the number of visitors. As well as John and herself, Elizabeth, Charlie and Peter had come with an assortment of grandchildren, including little Tina, who had toddled round the room lunging for ornaments and medicine bottles. His eyelids had hung so heavily and still throughout the visit that he might have been asleep. John sends his love. He's at the dentist today. Root canal treatment, poor love. Pamela settled herself in the armchair next to the window, manoeuvred his wheelchair so that he was facing her, and pulled out her needlework. She was stitching a new cover for the piano stool, a complicated trellis of entwined flowers that was testing her skill to the limit. He put off going, of course. You know what he's like. Turned out to be some horrible abscess. He's on antibiotics and everything. She fed the needle through one of the tiny holes in the hessian and gave it a sharp tug, checking before she continued that the back of her handiwork looked as tidy as the front. Her mother had always said that the sign of a truly good needlewoman was when the hidden stitches stood up to as much critical scrutiny as those on display, without knots or loops or loose ends. She would often add, in a tone so menacing that Pamela still quailed to recollect it, that it was the same with people, that truly good characters could be turned inside out without fear of what might be revealed. I'll read to you in a little while. I've brought a John Buchan, Green Mantle. I expect you've read it, but it's nice to reread things, isn't it? Like visiting old friends. Talking of visiting, did I tell you that the young man who wants to write about you is coming next week? So exciting. He's called Stephen Smith, and the book has been commissioned by some publishers in London. I hadn't heard of them, but John had. He's going to look out some of your bits and pieces from the attic. He said he might want to come and see you, though I said I'd check with you first. I don't want to put you under any strain, so we'll see how you are, shall we? You were never one for chatting to strangers very much, were you? She murmured, and paused in her stitching to sigh, then reached with a tissue to dab away a tiny overspill from the rheumy, half-closed eyes. John kept his mouth open as wide as he could, trying to ignore the ache in his jaw and the unpleasant sensation in his gums. Not pain exactly, but acute discomfort, as if pain was just round the corner and might explode into being at any time. The antibiotics hadn't entirely cleared up the infection, the dentist said. He would need another, stronger course, together with a couple more sessions of cleaning out the roots. 79 was wretchedly old, reflected John miserably, wishing he could close his jaw and run his tongue round his lips, which felt stretched and ready to split with dryness. "Okay down there?" The dentist offered a grin of encouragement over the top of his white mask. "Not much fun, I know, but we'll get there in the end, Mr. Harrison." John widened his eyes in an attempt at a response, thinking as he did so of Eric and the appalling tragedy of being trapped inside one's body without resource to communication of any kind. Who knew what his brother really thought and felt about anything? Pamela, like the dentist, was quite happy to pursue one-sided conversations, finding enough response in her imagination to continue for hours at a time. But even after 20 years, the sight of his stricken sibling still reduced John to a state of tongue-tied compassion, coupled, if he was honest, with a sort of terror that he might one day end up the same way, sliding towards death with a dribble on his lips. It was one of the harshest tricks of life, he mused, that one could choose neither the manner nor the moment by which one left it. Just that morning, over breakfast, he had read about a woman embarking on a legal battle to have herself killed. There had been a picture of her bent almost double in a wheelchair, her body all warped and witchy from some dreadful, disintegrating disease. Her stoic husband at her side, huge sleep-deprived pouches puckering his eyes, his lips thin with suffering and determination. John let his eyelids close, blocking out the glare of the dentist's angle-poised light. A small but persistent tickle had started at the edge of his left nostril. Would he take eternal life if it were offered to him? No, he wouldn't, John decided fiercely. Life only derived meaning through its transience. And yet he longed for the reassurance that he would leave some imprint on the world after his death, some echo of immortality, like Eric having an entire chapter devoted to his exploits in the war. For a brief moment, an absurd envy flickered inside John's heart. His own few months of active service, all spent in England, had been singularly inglorious, and a career in insurance would never warrant a biographer's interest. Access to anything equivalent would arise simply through the continuation of the family line, through his strapping sons and daughters, and Ashley House, of course, the jewel in the proverbial crown, nestling at the heart of the Harrison name. Cheered immensely by these thoughts, John opened his eyes to find the dentist pulling down his mask.
"There we are. You can close now, Mr. Harrison. Not too bad, I hope. I'd like to see you again in 5 days' time. The nurse will write out a new prescription. One more course should do it."
During the process of paying for his treatment, John remembered that he hadn't yet sent his 4 children their annual cash gifts of £750, £3,000 being their annual tax-free total that the Inland Revenue allowed. It wasn't much, and lately, with the recognition of his own advancing years, he had been considering ways of handing over more. While this was alarming in that the inevitable approach of death did not make pondering its implications any easier, he had discovered that being organised about such things was also rather consoling. On the way out of the surgery, John checked his appearance in the mirror, thoughtfully hung in the entrance hall, to see if his face looked as lopsided as it felt. It didn't, which was reassuring, although when he tried a smile only half of his lips moved, which was less good. It would be a couple of hours at least before he could decently manage even a cup of tea. As he got into his car, he checked his watch. There was still time to join Pamela at the nursing home, but he didn't really feel up to it. Instead, he would go back and rummage in the attic on Eric's behalf, he decided, a chore he had been putting off for days, deterred by both the physical effort of sifting through dusty boxes and the fact that he had no clear notion of what he was supposed to be looking for. Any memorabilia to do with Eric, Pamela had said, to help the biographer flesh out the facts. It would kill an hour or so anyway, John reasoned, give his face a chance to thaw to the point where he could manage some lunch. A few minutes later, he was lurching out of his parking space into what turned out to be a dangerously narrow break in the traffic. An approaching white van braked within a couple of feet of his rear bumper and hooted vigorously. "And the same to you, mate," John muttered, unnerved in spite of himself, and accelerated so hard that it was several hundred yards before he remembered to change gear. Cassie lathered the shampoo into her scalp with extra care. It was a matter of some pride that the white blonde waves of her hair had never acquired the boost of chemicals. They had the advantage, too, of camouflaging the few grey strands now sprouting along her parting, which she never dared pluck out for fear of the old adage about 2 twice as wiry growing in their place. Staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror as she towelled herself dry, she tried to imagine her features as they appeared to her lover, wishing she could be as sure of her own beauty as he seemed to be. She would have given anything to have met Dan earlier, ideally before he had married, but also before the hint of old lady wobble in her thighs and the permanent indentation of laugh lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth. His wife, Sally, was a couple of years younger than her, but, Dan gallantly assured her, far less attractive. They had met as medical students and got married because, after a few years of going out, it seemed the obvious thing to do. They had both gone on to qualify, she as an anaesthetist, he as a GP, but she'd given up working after the birth of their first child. Dan said that it was with the arrival of babies that things had started to go wrong, that as well as picking fights about everything, Sally had got sucked into the vortex of domesticity and let herself go. In subsequent years, things had deteriorated badly, sex in particular becoming a reflex action, a release of steam rather than an act of love. Cassie adored hearing such things, although when Dan showed her photos of his family, at her own request, she had wanted to know everything about him and had felt a sort of love for his children because they were his. The sight of his wife triggered neither the sense of triumph nor the half-baked pity she had been expecting. In none of the pictures did Sally look as if she'd let herself go. Casually dressed in jeans and T-shirts, her hair long and dark with a firm fringe, she had looked not only attractive, but also entirely normal, so wholly integrated into the family scenes. Buckets and lumpen sandcastles on beaches, barbecues with friends, toddlers clinging to her in fields and in front of famous monuments, that Cassie had experienced a surge of murderous resentment. How dare she, this attractive woman, so unappreciative, so selfish, so unloving, so nagging towards her dearest darling, hog the privilege of remaining at his side? It made her sick with anger. Dan was 40. His life was ticking by. He deserved some happiness. With her. Cassie gave her wet hair one last vigorous rub and hung the towel in a tidy rectangle back on the well. She was not by nature a tidy person, but these days made a special effort for Dan. His own house was, by all accounts, a tip, overflowing with piles of laundry and toys. Cassie wanted him to feel that her spacious two-bedroom flat in Pimlico was a haven of comfort and orderliness. Having emptied the bins, pummelled the sofa cushions, and switched on the table lamps, she set to work in the kitchen, unpacking the thick, bloodied slabs of fillet steak she had bought from the butcher and rereading the recipe for the béarnaise sauce she planned to serve alongside it. It was new to want to cook for a man. Normally, she would have been pressing to go out to restaurants, interested in enjoying courtship over appetising plates of food without the bother of having to prepare them. Left to her own devices, she was quite happy with polystyrene boxes and a microwave. But Dan had triggered in her an unprecedented desire to nurture. She wanted to rub his temples when he had a headache, to fold the clothes he left lying by her bed. If he'd asked her to, she would have gladly have washed his socks and clipped his toenails. He had beautiful feet, unlike those of any other man she had met, with slender, perfectly aligned...